As St. Lucia continues to respond to the global pandemic of COVID-19, the Ministry of Health and Wellness stresses on the need to place individuals in quarantine and isolation to prevent the spread of the virus. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sharon Belmar-George outlined the difference between quarantine and isolation.
We use quarantine for persons who are well and who may have been exposed to a communicable disease. So these are people who feel well, they're asymptomatic, that's what we call it, with no signs and symptoms, and they may have been exposed. So we monitor them during that incubation period to see whether or not they develop signs and symptoms. But if they do develop signs and symptoms, you would then need to isolate them. And during isolation is for persons who are showing signs and symptoms, that is, they are sick. Many times isolation would be done in a hospital or healthcare type setting where they can get treatment as well. Isolation is even stricter because when you develop the signs and symptoms, it means that you have the capacity to spread it to other persons.
Dr. Belmar-George also spoke on the procedures put in place for individuals in isolation, given that it requires stricter conditions.
From the beginning of isolation, we would have done the tests to see if you're negative or positive for the disease that you were exposed. So we would do the test and we would keep you within the facility. It would be a single room and we would give you the necessary treatment until after the isolation period of the disease, when you've recovered, we would then retest you, and until you get a negative test, we would then allow you to go home.
The Chief Medical Officer emphasized on the need for individuals to comply with the rules and regulations of the Quarantine Act.
The quarantine authority is the Chief Medical Officer. So the Chief Medical Officer has the powers to determine the location and the type and designate an area, a quarantine site. The Chief Medical Officer also has the power to decide which persons or things become within isolation, within the quarantine facility, and also indicate who can enter or leave the quarantine facility. It also gives the police the power to arrest, even without a warrant, someone who does not comply with the rules and regulations of the quarantine facility, which is set by the quarantine officer, who's the Chief Medical Officer.
The Ministry of Health and Wellness appeals to St. Lucians to continue adhering to the measures put in place to protect the nation from the virus. Reporting from the Ministry of Health and Wellness, I am Fennel Neptune.